ladies and gentlemen, we have the good fortune today to have four intellectual colossuses who are going to help us discuss the challenge of how we can better use data, forecasting and planning to help our companies become more competitively advantaged. And can please these gentlemen, or these people, ladies and gentlemen, please join us on the stage and I shall introduce them. But let me give you a perspective before this discussion begins. And it's a personal perspective. And the first thing I want to say is my wife is a CFO, so none of these gentlemen and ladies are going to pull any wool over my eyes, let me assure you. And the second thing is I lived and breathed the challenge of being a marketing manager responsible for capturing the forecasts from the business and treeing them up to the finance departments. It consumed the marketing department for 4 days every quarter, and everybody knew the figures were baloney. So how can we do things better? That was 25 years ago. We could see back then trend analysis would help us get more future ideas about what we need to do. And so I'm going to look for these people to help me in that analysis. And let me start with Paul Shetler. Paul is the director of Accelerate HQ. And Paul has been the government digital officer. And Paul has spent his career overseeing a number of major transformations in the organizations. We're talking about how we can transform the finance department. And so Paul will have some perspectives of that on his career. Alison Kluwer is the CFO at Ernst & Young, or EY I should say, sorry, EY I should say, and Alison admits to me that she is a fraud. Alison tells me,
Never said any such
Alison tells me that she is the CFO in an organization where the DNA of that organization is accountants, and she hasn't a single accounting credit to her record.
Wow.
So how do you do that? How do you lead accountants without that background? Alison will tell us how. Then I've got Milan. Now Milan Korbel runs data science at a division of McKinsey called Quantum Black. He is also the adjunct professor of AI at the University of Sydney. And as if we're going to have a clash of the intellectual powerhouses, on his left is Professor Toby Walsh, who is the professor of AI at the University of New South Wales. And Toby has spent his life since graduating in AI. So you can imagine the journey that we think is still embryonic for Toby. It must be in retirement age right now for where we are at AI. So I suppose I'm going to throw the question up, why, when we've got all these tools to do forecasting, we can use data to get predictions of the future, why are we not using it more?
People, more than anything, I think, people don't realize, it still needs quite a lot of sophistication and nous to drive these tools. It's not something that, it's not like your spreadsheet where anyone can work out how to use it. And there is a great shortage of people in the field. People don't realize, we get employers, big companies ring us up and say, can we come and speak to your graduating class? And we say, how many people are you interested in employing? They say, how big is the class? We say, well, we're graduating 300 people. They say, we can employ all of them. And we say, well, it doesn't quite work like that. There's another, 200 other companies are going to come and talk to them as well. I have graduate students who get offered $1 million salaries to go and work for companies, tech companies. I mean, it's amazing shortage of people. And that is a real challenge, I think, for any organization. And the advice I give any organization is the best place to find talent is to grow your own people.
Okay, well, it seems the only option if that's what's happening to the graduates of an organization.
On the plus side, enrollment at UNSW, and I suspect at Sydney and everywhere else, is 25% up this year than last year, which was up 25% the year before. So we're seeing exponential increases, but that's going to take time to filter through, and that's still not going to satisfy the tenfold plus over demand that we see for people.
Well, that's an interesting thing, because what Toby's saying is it's not the culture in organizations which is reluctant to embrace them, it's finding the skill sets. You're shaking your head a bit at that.
No, I don't disagree. I think, though, it's not just that.
No.
So I think there's a real misnomer that the technology is itself solving your problems, or the tools themselves are the end. What I see is a focus on the implement the tool itself, and sometimes a failure to actually leverage and enable that tool. And that comes down to the people and the skills. So if you think the tool's your answer, that's where I see an issue. And I suppose increasingly a focus on the implement and the activity being the thing that we focus the value on. I went live with technology. Well, that's the beginning of the journey rather than the end. But there's a lot of focus on the go live and the implement. I think we sometimes lose a bit of interest on the enable and the leverage. Yeah. And again, you've got to have the skills. And I would say my own organisation, those skills need to be developed, which we have a focus on. But I read something this morning, it said, do all finance people need to become data analytics and data scientists? Well, no, but they're going to have a part of their curriculum or part of their capability that feeds that. Yeah. So.
Well, Milan, that's an interesting thing, because when we were talking beforehand, you were impressing on me that AI in itself isn't a solution. It has to work with the people to actually use it to realize the potential within that sort of stuff. Is that things that you think organizations fully understand? Do they think they're buying a tool, or do they think they're buying actually an answer to their problems?
Yeah, I think very often people, the companies I work with think that it's sort of a plug and play, and it's not. It's really a hard work to develop it. Actually, it's 50% of the resources spent on the development is actually spent on the implementation and the adoption, and that's quite big. So it's really talent, it's the change management. It's a really big thing, and I think the change management has two aspects. One is the trust, and the second one is the fear. So trust, people think they have sort of they believe they can do better, and fear, they feel that it's going to replace their work. So those are the two aspects. But I think the third one, what I would like to say is the data, the information. I would say not really data, information. Is that if you develop an AI, it's smart enough only what you give it. So very often it requires, let's say, this amount of information, and we have half of it, and that half of it is corrupted, missing. So that's another sort of third aspect of it.
Yeah, Paul, you were quite firm, maybe the right word, about organizations embracing this sort of technology. You think you've got to be more bolder, and people are being made tentative, trying to handhold people to this transition.
Well, it's not so much that I think people are trying to handhold people through a transition. It's just that I think that whenever you go through any kind of change in an organization, you'll always have a lot of pushback. And you can see this in any kind of digital technology that we're talking about. And it's never the case, that putting in a web server, or putting in the internet, or putting in something which does amazing statistical analysis, aka AI, is going to change your organization. It won't. The people actually change your organization. And if you don't get them actually doing the right things with it and using this in the way you want them to, then the question really becomes, I suppose, change management. But I would prefer to say change the management, because I think that's probably much more effective. And if you actually look at massive things which actually have worked, like, say, across the UK government, where they actually did digitize large parts of what they were doing, pretty much every CIO was opposed to it. That meant that pretty much every CIO was fired. And was replaced with chief digital officers and chief technology officers. They changed the management, and in so doing, they also changed the organization.
Okay. Why do you think there's a cultural challenge in Australia that we have to address in terms of forecasting? I mean, I'm thinking, or predicting, I'm thinking we're in a situation now with the worst drought in Australia's history, and you would not, the response people are giving is the impression that it's taken them all by surprise, that they would never have envisaged a drought in Australia. And all the responses seem like knee-jerking. Is there a challenge from that in our leadership that's actually accepting gut instinct as a way to run our businesses, rather than trusting the data to do it? Does anyone want to take that sort of thought?
I'll start maybe
Go on.
on this
I
one.
think we probably all got a view on that.
Yeah, go on.
I mean, so for me, I mean, I'm from overseas, obviously, so I'm not from here. So I might have a different view than other people because I see different things. And one of the things which I noticed quite a bit was there's not as much drive, hunger, whatever you want to call it, in Australian business as there is, say, in the UK or in the United States or China or other countries which are really advancing very quickly. And I think that's probably it's one of the reasons you don't really need to have a lot of forecasting skill if you know that your population is going to be increasing by a certain amount per year. That's going to cause real estate prices to go up. It's going to give you a wealth effect, and that'll cause other sectors to do fairly well. And you've really only got a few different things you're really focusing on with the economy. So I think Australia hasn't been through a crisis. Hasn't been through a crisis in 26, 27, 28 years now. And without that, crises do have a good thing. They clear out the deadwood, and they also make people hungry. Yeah. And they also force people to start thinking about the future and to start strategizing and to position themselves against other people and to see where things might be going and how can they navigate their organization to the spot they want them to get to. And I think without that sense of urgency, pretty much any human activity tends towards being relatively flaccid.
And yet, Toby, for all people wanting to take your graduates, it shows, that people do see the potential. It's not as if there is some recognition in the business
There is,
leadership.
but there's always the problem of risk, right? I mean, so robo-debt is a wonderful example, right? And now government is incredibly fearful of doing anything because they, burnt their hands once, and it doesn't, the agile development cycle that you need to be able to get AI to work doesn't necessarily mesh with the way that many old-fashioned businesses work.
Yeah.
But I think there's, again, and I don't know if you see this in your businesses, but it doesn't matter what your tools are or what your capability is, there's got to be appetite. There's got to be, I suppose, a commitment. If you take forecasting as an example, I just think that's a DNA thing. You either believe in the power of a credible forecast or you don't, or you either have a need for it. So I suppose I come from multinational publicly listed company where you had to get that right. So you had to have the tools and you relied heavily, and the algorithms were sort of within an inch of exactness in terms of pipeline predictions, for instance, through to probably where I am now, where there's a different emphasis on forecast because there's different drivers. Yep. And so again, I come back to the fact it starts with the intent, the appetite, the desire to get to something that's accurate and credible and tells you where you're headed. And then the tools kick in behind that. But I don't think it goes the other way around. I don't think just because you've got great data, great tools, you're suddenly going to be into the idea of a forecast. And so,
Well, Milan, can I bring you in here from your sort of manufacturing background there about how that forecasting in terms of resource planning is so important. But the challenge you also highlight to me was that the variables in forecasting aren't just financial. There's other elements that people need to put into their projections.
Yeah, just going back to that, what you said about the fires and so on. For example, I have a team in the US, in Alaska, and we were modeling some system that was influenced by the water coming, from the ice, and the historical data cannot be used anymore because the climate changed so much. Just recent 6 months. It's so changed that you cannot build almost any data models unless you put some more physics into it. And that's actually answers the question that it applies in manufacturing, it applies in forecasting, that you can use the historical data to create a model, the architecture of the model, for example, to predict, but you have to put it in the boundaries of, let's say, physics. In manufacturing, like material balances. The mass coming in has to equal mass coming out. Artificial intelligence can ignore that. So you have to put it in. And the same thing in business. And the third thing will be that the system evolves. So if there is a new change, new data coming in, especially in forecasting, all the politics, so everything is so much changes that the AI never have seen, right? So you have to update that, you have to give that information. So for all of those reasons, you need the expert work with the AI. It's almost never, unless you have a deterministic system, it's never alone. It has to work with the people. Yeah.
Okay. But I'm interested that why we aren't making more. Where do we start this journey with AI? Because in the organisation we can see is part of the inertia a reflection of the fact people don't know how to start to commence. We can leverage it effectively.
Right.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, sort of 101 for me, at least from a consulting perspective, is sort of map it and understand where is the value, right? And then select the most sort of, I would say, feasible, and then test it there, right? And I think it's not only the pilots, but it requires quite a lot of other stuff, like cultural change, the talent. So very often I challenge, you can do pilots, but at the end, if you really want to be doing transformation, with artificial intelligence, then you have to include all of those aspects of the business. Yeah.
But is there inertia? I suppose I'm questioning.
You
whether-
used the term to me, organisational laziness was a term that you used in our
Did I really?
discussion.
Did I say that? No, but I also think that we're in danger of sort of holding it out here and thinking it as this special thing when probably embedded in half the technologies used in this room have an underpinning AI component to it. I think there's a danger that we nearly sort of become fearful of this thing.
Yeah.
And I think it's happening, it's there. Do we leverage it as fully as we can? Probably not. But I think it's an increment. I think to your point, it's a step by step. It's not it's never going to be big bang. Pretty obvious. But I think it's there, and maybe it's more recognising the value that we have the inertia around, as opposed to not doing AI as such. Because I think we are.
I think the challenge is that you shouldn't approach this by saying we need some AI.
Yes.
I mean, that's like saying we need some electricity in our business. Yeah, well, of course you do.
Yeah.
But it's pervasive technology that could be applied to so many different parts of your business. What are the frictions in your business? What is the thing that is holding your business back? And maybe AI is one of the tools that will help you do that. But rather than say, oh, we need to tick the box that we're cutting edge, we're doing AI.
That's it.
To say, well,
Yeah.
is it our customer experience?
But can I challenge that, Toby? Sorry.
I'd like to make a point of actually reinforcing that. So I think you'd mentioned Robodebt, which is an absolute, pretty much unmitigated disaster from DHS. It's shameful. And DHS have learned a little bit from that as well, as much as they deny it.
Yeah.
They're working on a new AI ethics framework and so on and so forth. There's all these various things happening. If you look across the federal government, and certainly if you look into state governments, there's an awful lot of interest in how you can use AI specifically to improve the customer experience. That's the main thing right now, and it's huge. Everybody wants to do that. Now, do they know how to do that necessarily? Maybe not just yet, right? Because they're just coming to terms with it. They're just starting to figure out how to learn this. But I think that's a much better way of looking at the problem, because it's not a problem of too much or too little AI. It's a question of, are we doing things the way we want to, and is AI going to be a useful tool to helping us get to the point we want to get?
Well, but though, Paul, what you're saying though, and the part of the problem with the Robodebt thing, it's a big bang transformation. All of a sudden, it's implemented, and people start fearful of it. And we all know as technologists, the best way to do is you do pilots, you get evidence, and you evolve it and grow it.
Yeah, there's lots of issues with that.
They
There were
were
lots of
told
issues
it
with the way
would
Robodebt was done. There was lots of
Yeah.
issues with the way they decided to not do any checks. There's lots of issues with the steps that they decided to eliminate in the process and to automate, which earlier were not automated. There was lots of things that they did wrong. And yes, they could have done things in an iterative fashion, but that wasn't within the culture of the organization, right?
Yeah.
When I was heading up DTO, I had conversations with the secretary there, say, you should do things in a more iterative fashion. Well, it didn't get very far because, they ran in a particular way, right? And for their model, that was the only way that they could see they could get things done, this big, heavy industrial model,
Yeah.
scale, scale, scale. And then it finally broke.
Yeah.
But the failure issue, I think, and then your last speaker picked up on it, I think organisations want to be innovative, they talk fail fast. I don't know you, but we talk this fail fast, we love the idea of it. I'm probably yet to see an organisation that's really comfortable with failure. So I think there is the risk element of this is challenging, and then you get the high profile, I suppose, failures, if you want to call them that. Yeah. That's an inhibitor, I think. There's this notion of we want to be innovative, we know that means that X out of projects won't work well. But actually when they don't work well, it can be quite career harming, I think.
Yeah.
But
What's
that's
the
when you do
culture?
things sort of in an alpha or a prototype stage, right? So that's when you're testing so early on that whatever failure is there, really, it's not a failure, right? You just had tested a hypothesis, and the hypothesis, oops, that wasn't what we thought it was. You know what? How much did we spend on that? We spent $50,000. Okay, fine. Next thing, rather than billions of dollars.
Yeah.
But you're also alluding there, Paul, in the challenge that you've got direction set on top with people who have bigger political political agenda, political in a broader sense agenda, you know, organizations here will have an executive leadership who have targets to meet, objectives to thing, and they want to be bold and the time frames are short. And so it's how you work with that mindset, you know? How can you...
That's a great mindset to work within. Time box things, do less, get things done quicker, test them, iterate them, move fast, rather than long dilated time frames where I've got 5 years to put out Whippet, or 10 years, or whatever. I don't know what the window is now, right? And I'm going to keep on expanding the scope as I throw more dollars at it. Yes, it's very ambitious. Will it ever be delivered?
No. Melan, did you want to come in on that?
No, I think it's important. I like the concept sort of you know, going quickly and having a weekly or bi-weekly sort of outputs and then keeping adjusting it. As an example from manufacturing, but you know, it really can apply to any sort of development of AIs. But just recently, I'm not sure you have seen in Financial Times, there was an article from Freeport, and the way so it's a big sort of refinery on copper. And we have helped them develop sort of artificial intelligence that looks at across the whole plant. So it's not anymore sort of like small cases. It's really the AI is talking to the operators and maintenance and everybody how to drive the plant. And the way how to deliver it, it's not just going in a rabbit hole and come back because it's not going to work. It's really working with the whole sort of refinery and the data scientists iteratively every week, every second week, releasing a new version of it, testing it, and basically it takes 4 to 6 months to nail it, and then maintain it going forward, of course. But those iterative cycles are super important in these situations.
They are, and they actually get us to another question about CFOs, right? Because then you get to the point, you know, how do you fund these things, right?
Yeah.
And you know, then the big business cases. It allows you, working that way allows you to start breaking through
Absolutely.
an awful lot of the inertia that comes from the funding process, that then goes through the procurement process, that then winds up ultimately, you know, through governance and horrible IT at the end. Because it allows you to take very small risks, deal with them very, very quickly, not have to go through the traditional processes, and to fund things on a more of a VC model.
Exactly.
But Toby, I'm interested in, sorry, you just come in here, Melan. Toby, you, at the university, you would have been doing this, as you said, since you've graduated, and I would be interested how you sort of maintain commitment to the sort of the things. How do you grow the evidence? When are you satisfied that you've got something that you want to develop and take forward? What's that iterative evolution for you?
Well, I mean, there is there's obviously a business development lesson to be learned from things like RoboDebt, but there's actually a technical AI lesson, which is that, and it's really important that it's not magic, and it doesn't have the capabilities that most people assume it has, and it breaks in ways that humans don't. It doesn't have the common sense, and it started sending out notices that humans would have easily seen were ridiculous.
Yeah.
But because it's you know, artificial intelligence is not anything close to human intelligence, it has no common sense to work out, and it breaks in ways that humans would never have broken.
Absolutely.
And that's an important lesson wherever you might be applying AI into your business, is that it's not magic here. And it will do strange things that will surprise you. And therefore you have to make sure that you've put in sufficient protections and tested it in ways that is not going to blow up in your face.
But Toby, we had this discussion before about sat-navs. You know, only a fool would rely completely on a sat-nav system.
And there are a few fools who have driven off cliffs.
But you do use a human check. Is that the right decision for me?
Well, yeah, I mean, that was, you know...
It's a must, yeah.
That was, you know, the cardinal sin, I think, of RoboDebt was that they were told at the start that you can't, you know, correlate people's data across multiple data sources and do it exactly without making errors, and sending out debt notices without any human oversight was going to be a problem, and it was.
And what I want to just add, it's not only about the development of those tools to be accurate and so on, but also about the change management.
Yep.
So when you work to those cycles with the people that will use the tool, right, from the beginning to the end, they will feel that's their tool, that's their baby. They adopt it much quicker, and it also promotes sort of interdepartmental collaboration as well, because you work as a multidisciplinary team.
I mean, that was the second cardinal sin, was that they were immediately getting people complaining, and it took them a long time to respond, and they committed even more pain and problems before they actually realized that actually they need to do something.
Well, then they dug a hole for themselves.
Yeah, and then then it became a political problem.
But they also, to be honest, and let's be fair about this, they also knew these were problems, and they knew these were problems,
Yes.
and they did not care and I know that for a fact.
Yeah. Well,
And I think that everybody that went to the very, very, very top of the public service in Australia, went right to the top of the PMC.
yeah.
There was knowledge of what this was doing, and that says an awful lot. I think that says an awful lot. We can talk about customer experience and this and that. We can have our wonderful digital journey maps, but then if you've got senior management that knows that this is a problem and tries to justify it, then your testing and all this doesn't matter.
But it is a good example. AI can do some really wonderful things. And a story that broke just yesterday or the day before, which is Apple, right? A company that dozens, hundreds of my colleagues, AI researchers, some of the best researchers and AI researchers on the planet, work for Apple, and yet they can't get the Apple credit scoring algorithm to work, and they can't explain it. And I'm sure they had no intention at all to commit the terrible sexist crimes that they did. So if a company like Apple can fail like that publicly, then you have to realize that these are technologies that are brittle, and you have to make sure, be very careful, but build it in a way that is not going to hurt your business, because that's hurt Apple's business. And if they get it wrong, then what hope for the rest of us?
Absolutely.
But then how do people in the corporate world push back at the data that's produced that they think, actually, this is not right. We need to double down on this. We need to challenge and question that when it may satisfy an objective that somebody seeks, but the outcome needs to be questioned.
This is why you need this rapid development cycle and to be able to iterate very quickly and try it on a small group of people where it's not going to blow up in your face and all these things that you've been talking about.
Yeah, but I think there are two sort of groups of people. One would be sort of that they don't believe in it, they don't want to accept it, and then there is people more sort of progressive that they accept it. But in general, how you want to sort of equalize that, I would say it's sort of it's education of your organization. So you run them through academies, through sort of online classes, so people understand more, at least from a sort of a translational level, what the AI does and what are the limitations of the AI.
Yeah. But it's not the tech that goes wrong. The technology or the AI is doing exactly what it's been developed to do.
Exactly.
It's either the human engagement that sits around that, to your point around change, which is a much harder part of this, or it's the data, which is also a much harder part of this. I mean, ironically, the things you need to get right are not actually the tech, it's the inputs, or at least my experience is that's where you ultimately often spend the least time but need to spend the most time. The most predictable bit is actually the technology. But it's fascinating how we get quite caught up in that part of a project, I find. And maybe that's because it's the most controllable part. It's these other things that are far less able to be controlled that I find we underinvest in.
Well, and particularly, Alison, the challenge of the data that feeds these systems and the fragmentation of that data across business, the different, the quality can be poor, it's non-sexy, isn't it, to try and cleanse data?
Trust me. And I mean, we're going to SAP Financials in the next 6 months, so data's top of mind for me at the moment, particularly if I look at the legacy platforms that we're coming from. And to get executive attention on data, I mean, I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted here. This is not a topic anyone wants to talk about. It's not a topic that's seen to be something we want to pull our client-facing organisation away. It's just hard to get the traction. And yet probably the single most important part of what we'll do is get the data right. And the second most important is to drive the change in business readiness of our employees to use that system. Tech itself, done, sorted, we'll get it in. And yet the thing we're most fascinated with is a go-live date. So that's going to happen. We're going to give birth to that baby. But I think it's the parenting skills that go around that and that concerns me. Because that's far harder to control.
Miller?
I think it has a lot to do with the ethos of the organization that's using things, right? So, and I think that, the example that Professor Walsh gave was, Apple, company which, humane and, warm and fuzzy, and everybody thinks of as a very user-friendly company, and then this thing happens, right? Shock, right? But, there are other organizations that perhaps don't have that same reputation, and those are the ones you would probably be very leery of. So I really think, that's also kind of the lens I would look at these things through, which is really, what kind of company is it?
Well,
what is it actually involved in? What is the ethos of the people who work there? Do they have any sense of ethical use?
Well, Paul, what somebody said to me over lunch was, I mean, the real problem with the Apple was it was Steve Wozniak's wife, I think, that was the catalyst for this. If it happened Joe Blow's wife, would that have had the same impact on the thing, and how you got prominence for these things, you know? And because the challenge with AI is we're asking people at the front line of our businesses to implement and follow this. They have to have confidence in that this data's right, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah, just on the data, I would just say that it's always looks so dark, transforming the whole organization and making sure that the data in one place and what sort of strategy. But I always encourage when I work with my clients is go really step by step. Just focus on, for example, 1 case, 2 cases, and just implement those data and make sure that they are clean, and then establish sort of data management processes around those data. And it's so important. It seems much smaller and it's much more digestible. But just going back for what you just said earlier, that, and I agree with you very, very often, you have to sort of design hypotheses before you develop the AI. But it's always going in cycles. Like, for example, one of the companies that designed an AI that was recommending who to hire, right? And they identified that there was discriminant because of last 10 years. They basically said, in the last 10 years, we had those high-performing individuals in the company, learn from it. And it was recommending all males. So they found out, okay, so let's not put sex in there. Okay, so let's go back again. And still it was just males. So we had to go really, and it was basically like college. The women college, we're going to a women college. And this sort of data that you would never even think about.
Yeah.
So it's really iterative process to make sure that you don't have a discriminant in your model.
Well, in our discussion beforehand, Milan, you made a quite telling point to me that we have to have a willingness to be learning from data. Sometimes learning that the data is giving us answers that are wrong, but also the data is giving us insights about how we can do things better. Could you elaborate a bit more on your thinking there?
I'm not sure I remember that.
Go on.
But I'll elaborate for him. There is a fundamental challenge, right? If you're using historical data to make predictions about the future, that if you're not careful, and the hiring example, the sexist hiring is a classic example, which is that you will just recreate the biases and the problems of the data, the system in which it was collected, and not actually end up with a better future. Because what you're trying to predict is who is the best qualified person, independent of sex, to promote or hire into a position. You don't have that data.
Exactly.
You will never have that data. You have the historical data of who happened to get promoted, who did well. And that was collected within a system maybe that was biased against women or biased against people of color. Yep. And so you will just perpetuate those biases unless you then take the data but do something active to make sure that you don't recreate the problems of the system in the past in which that data was collected. And that's the fundamental challenge with data, is you can make some wonderful predictions for data, but it will only repeat what happened in the past.
Absolutely.
And not take you to necessarily to the better future you want to be in.
It'll make you the best that you've been,
Yes.
rather than anything different.
Yes, and repeat all the biases and that you did in the past.
And it's to answer that question, I actually remember, so it links to this very much, that learning from data is that when you, it was in one of the situation, predictive maintenance of a huge reactor, very expensive, and it kept telling us that one of the most important feature is the size of the shoes of the operators. Then you kind of dig into it and you realize, coincidentally, it was the group of maintenance guys that kind of were always, maintaining it not properly. And so, you learn from the data, but it can get funny at some point.
You have to ask yourself, why were they putting that into the data set? Shoe size.
It's just like sometimes people just want to go for everything. Like.
Okay. Shoe size might be important, and it was.
Yeah.
I think we're right towards the end of the presentation now, and I suppose if I would sum up what I think I've got from the 4 panelists is the potential of AI is there, and it will offer us an opportunity to be more effective in the future, but we can't neglect the importance of the human mind to actually complement that data. So it's not replacing us, it's adding to our lives, and I think that should be the heart from what you've just told us. So thank you very much. Cheers. Can we please thank them? I also have to apologize to my friend and colleague Marco, who did a wonderful slide that I was meant to have as the backdrop for this discussion, which I was unable to get forward onto my thing. So apologies, Marco, that your talent wasn't seen. But thank you, panelists, please.
Very much. Ooh.